about trespassing in the state of Texas when you are illegally crossing into the United States. We continue our conversation with former Fourth Court of Appeals Judge Beth Watkins and what the court had to decide and why. Now we are joined again by Judge Beth Watkins, who's a former judge of the Court of Appeals, the Fourth Court of Appeals here in Bexar County, but you really had a lot of counties. It wasn't just Bexar County. Welcome, Judge.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for having me.
And when we left off, we were talking about Operation Lone Star, and we explained right before we started this interview what it was, but you had one county above all others that just stood out.
Absolutely.
Which county?
So we talked a little bit about Operation Lone Star, and counties could opt in or opt out to Operation Lone Star. One of the 32 counties in the Fourth Court of Appeals District that opted in to Operation Lone Star is Kinney County. And I don't know, the county seat of Kinney County is Bracketville. I don't know how many people in your viewing district are familiar with it. But in the 2020 census, Kinney County has 3,129 people total.
Yes.
In the whole county.
Yes.
2 licensed lawyers. One is the elected county judge and one is the elected county attorney. So the overwhelming majority of Operation Lone Star appeals that the Fourth Court of Appeals got throughout all of Operation Lone Star, the overwhelming majority of them came from Kinney County. This teeny tiny, it's got, I think, about 8 miles along the border.
Yes. I drive through it a lot, yeah, and it's crazy because you're like, did we go through it already? And I mean, give them those numbers, because I know when we talked, the numbers to me were like, oh my gosh.
So, you know, the Court of Appeals, we get most of it's all of Bexar County and all of 31 other counties in South and Central Texas. Bexar is the big county, right? So that's where the overwhelming majority of appeals to the Fourth Court come from. But when you're talking about Operation Lone Star, the overwhelming majority came from Kinney County, which is a county that the Fourth Court of Appeals doesn't historically get a lot of appeals from. In fact, in the 25 years before Operation Lone Star started, there were only 17 appeals total from Kinney County, 17 appeals in 25 years. And then once Operation Lone Star started, those numbers exploded. And in the first year that Operation Lone Star existed, there were almost 400 appeals from just Kinney County.
How many appeals does the Fourth Court of Appeals normally get in a normal year?
About 900. And these are round numbers, right?
From all of the counties.
From all of the counties.
But you had about 400 from one county.
In maybe a 2-year period. It was, but
still,
it was a tremendous spike.
Were you prepared? Did you guys have the tools necessary? And when you're talking about the tools, you're talking about paralegals, legal assistants,
attorneys, judges, lawyers to represent these defendants on appeal. There's a whole process of, the things that go on behind the scenes at the courthouse. And I have to tell you, on day one, the Fourth Court of Appeals didn't have the infrastructure in place, but the Fourth Court scaled up incredibly quickly to be able to handle this. We had a great clerk of court, amazing front office staff, and they just rolled up their sleeves and jumped into this with both feet. Because the volume, when it seemed like cases were kind of coming in waves. So if there would be one hearing in the trial court, maybe there would be 200 defendants in that one hearing. Well, the judge would sign one order that applied to all of them. And so then those 200 defendants would all take an appeal. Those cases would all come in at the same time, and we're having to try and process them fast, right? Because like we talked about last time, the clock was ticking.
Yes.
And so very quickly we scaled up. The way that appellate courts are funded, and I promise I won't go into this for too long, is based on the volume of cases that you normally get. So like Dallas and Houston have more judges, they have more attorneys, they have more staff than San Antonio. But all of a sudden, the San Antonio Court of Appeals was getting more appeals because of Operation Lone Star than all of Dallas, than all of Houston. We didn't have the judges. We didn't have the attorneys. And so that process was very stressful.
Now, when you're looking at these cases, one thing that stands out, most of them were men.
Correct. So, one of the very first cases that the Fourth Court decided on this topic was a case under the Equal Protection Clause of the United States and of the Texas Constitutions. So, we talked last time about the problems that Kinney County and the other counties who had started Operation Lone Star were having because they didn't have enough jail cells to handle the volume of people that they were arresting. Remember, last time we talked about they were basically being sent to warehouses. And what the state did in these cases is very quickly, like the Fourth Court of Appeals scaled up, the state very quickly scaled up in terms of the warehouses that it could put these defendants in, but it only had those facilities in place for men. It did not have facilities in place for women, but men and women were both crossing.
So what was happening to them?
So if there was a group of just men, they were all arrested. They were sent to the criminal justice system. They were brought before a magistrate and the charges were brought against them. If it was a group of women, that's not what happened. If it was a group of women, the DPS or the Texas National Guard's troopers would detain them and then would call the feds, would call ICE, and the immigration officials would come and only deport the women. They wouldn't start criminal proceedings against them. So that was a big problem. And then there was a big problem about what happened with people, with groups that weren't only men or only women. What if it was a group of men and women? What if it was a group of men and women and children? We all remember the first Trump administration and the process of separating families at the border and just how inhumane that process was. There were a lot of lessons that the judicial system learned as a result of all of that. And so all of these different agencies were working together to try and make sure that we were doing, what due process requires.
Okay, so you get the Cifuentes case. And what are you dealing with at this time? I mean, this is all over TV. You're a former judge now. That's why you're sitting down and talking to us. Now you can talk about it. I mean, you are watching this going on. And regardless, you guys are all elected, Democrat, Republican,
Correct.
Independent, which we don't see a lot of independent. But I mean, at the same time, though, you are representing Lady Justice, which is the reason why she has blindfolds on, because you're not supposed to care about Democrat or Republican. So what's going on through your mind as you're seeing all of this happening on TV? And you know that you guys have this case sitting there that's probably going to shape what happens to everybody else.
Absolutely. So I'm glad that you brought up about the fact that Lady Justice is blindfolded and she's got scales. You also brought up the word independent. And when we talk about the independence of the judiciary, that is huge. And it's the biggest part and the hardest part, I think, for a lot of judges is taking off your own personal views, taking off, your lived experiences and the cases that I worked on and just what my political beating heart feels about these families and just following the law. So, judges have to take an oath of office, and that oath basically says you don't rule based on what you think is right. You have to just follow the law. And so what we were doing at the Fourth Court of Appeals is just following the law. We talked about the Cifuentes case and the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure that says if the state's not ready for trial within 15 days, then the state shall release the defendant on a PR bond or a bond they can afford. And so what we saw is the mandates of due process not being complied with. And so we jumped into action really fast, regardless of our own political views of what the right solution is to the immigration problem, what the right answer is to the question that, Washington hasn't answered for us in all of these years. And we just applied the statutes that say what is required to happen. It's hard, though, and that takes a tremendous toll on you. But, when we're talking about legal aid, right, they had to like scale up really fast and open up offices and get lawyers to represent the defendants in these areas. They had to find warehouses because the jails weren't big enough to hold the volume of men that they were arresting. But right at the beginning, when the Fourth Court of Appeals started receiving these appeals, we did not have any additional resources. We didn't have any extra money to go and hire new lawyers or new front office staff, legal secretaries that could help process the tremendous volume of new cases that were being filed at the Fourth Court of Appeals. And so, these cases kind of came in waves, and you could just see it on the faces of our front office staff. When these waves were coming in, it was overwhelming, and they did an amazing job. I mean, Herculean effort. They were taking laptops home. They were working at nights. They were working on the weekend to make sure that these cases were getting processed on time and that everything was happening to keep the wheels of justice turning smoothly.
When you say warehouse, because you've said it several times, I don't think people can picture exactly, because they're thinking a jail. We have jail standards that makes sure that everybody's housed in a way, because we're depriving you of your liberty because of something that you did. But explain to the people that are listening, when you say warehouse, you literally mean a warehouse.
It's been a minute since I've gone back and looked at the data about it, but I think that there are 2 detention facilities, or at least at the time, there were 2 detention facilities, and one of them used to be a Walmart, right? And all of the shelves had been taken out of it. It wasn't a functioning Walmart anymore. And they just put a bunch of beds in there, and it was literally just a warehouse. It wasn't a jail with individual cells, to my knowledge. It was just a huge open air warehouse with a bunch of beds.
And in the middle of the Texas Sea.
In the middle of the Texas Sea. Exactly.
Wow, incredible. So I want to ask you, but before we let you go, because we're gonna have to do another podcast just on where Operation Lone Star stands now. When you received these cases, many of the people you said had already done plea deals.
Mm-hmm.
How many cases did you end up with?
Hundreds. But without getting too much into the appellate nerd weeds, if you've taken a plea deal, then you have essentially mooted out your appeal, because a court of appeals can only decide actual cases, not hypothetical cases or cases about a future injury, only what's called live cases. And so once these defendants took a plea deal, that mooted out their appeal, their ability to seek redress of the state's violation of their due process rights. So a lot of cases would get filed, right? The Cifuentes case that we talked about, it started with 144 defendants. At one point, there were 153 defendants that were involved in that case. But because of plea deals that the state was reaching with these defendants while they were sitting incarcerated, at the end, there were only 4 defendants that were the subject of our opinion in the Cifuentes case, because every single other defendant had taken a plea agreement with the state and had essentially mooted out their right to seek appellate relief.
You kind of have to wonder, and out of all of those that accepted the plea deal, how many of them came back into the United States illegally? And it's supposed to be deterrent. So did it really deter, or did it just prolong, or, hey, we're going to do a timeout. We're going to go back to Mexico, but we're coming right back.
I think only time will tell on that. But I know logic tells me what the answer is.
They came back. I'm sure of it. Because a lot of people that we see, they do, if they get expelled out of the country or deported, they wait and they come back. Many of the people are coming from Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, or other countries, and they did the track through Panama.
Which is so deadly.
It's deadly. So you survive that. You survive Mexico and the cartels. Are you truly going to go back the other way?
I cannot imagine how horrible their living circumstances must be at home, especially for the women with children who are subjecting their children. I mean, the Darien Gap is the most deadly place on the planet. And so for people to cross through there, to know that even the risk of crossing through there is less than the risk of danger of them staying in their home countries, it just breaks my heart.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the podcast, and we are going to do a number 3 with former Judge Beth Watkins of the 4th Court of Appeals. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Friends, that is all for this week's episode of Immigration Crisis, The Fight for the Southern Border. We will be back out in the Del Rio, Eagle Pass, Rio Grande, and El Paso area with all of our colleagues the night before President Trump takes his oath of office to see exactly if there are any changes that take place immediately after he is sworn in. From San Antonio, Texas, I am Yami Virgin. Have a wonderful new year, and we will be right there with you, reporting from the southern border.